We came together yesterday embracing this unique opportunity to emphasize the centrality of governance to successful and sustainable development. We've embarked on this consultation dialogue, knowing that this is a first endeavor and a new endeavor for all of us. We were bringing together parliamentarians and civil society to discuss an international framework for the 21st century that we hope would reflect the reality of people's lives and experiences. This particular consultation will be followed by a consultation in the Asia-Pacific region. So to a large degree, they'll draw on the successes from this particular consultation. They will learn from our challenges and they will build on this moving forward. The views and opinions that have been expressed yesterday and today have been captured by the rapporteurs and the peer reviewers. Some of the main messages that have come out is that governance is a complex and wide-ranging concept that encompasses a range of issues, including institutions, principles and instruments cutting across the spectrum of local, national, regional and international levels. On institutions, one of the main messages, key messages, was that governance is often about institutions, which include parliaments, public administration, judiciary, and independent electoral institutions. But democratic governance does not end with institutions. The fundamental question is whether those institutions are responsive to the needs and demands of people and have a positive impact on people's lives. We tend to overuse the term empowerment. It does, however, capture a theme that came through in the discussions. Governance is only as good as the capacity of people to access institutions, to access information, and to hold governments to account. We must invest in institutions, but also invest in the people. Many called for empowering women and building and increasing their political space. We heard appeals that Africa should not wait for its version of the Arab awakening to address issues facing youth and building governance that better serve future generations. On this aspect, some participants raised the importance of allowing the space for institutions of accountability to fulfill their functions. It was further recognized that Parliament and legislatures is a critical check and balance and a fundamental element of the governance structure that must be allowed to fulfill its important functions. And there was a lot of discussion in this regard. There was a further recognition of civil society's critical role as a mechanism for monitoring and accountability, and also that the required space and access to information to operate must be granted and safeguarded in Africa and elsewhere. And hence you would see in India that there's not just talk about access to information, but about the right to information as well. We need to ensure that in the further consultations and dialogues that the private sector is more directly engaged. On African experience, a further message that came loudly and clearly from this meeting was the importance of formulating a new agenda that takes into account the African experience. And in part, the experience is one of building regional institutions and mechanisms, the Pan-African Parliament, the African Union, and the African peer review mechanism, ensuring that these regional institutions fully occupy their space, but are empowered to do so and are able to be effective. Together, African countries have developed not only regional governance mechanisms, but also an African identity based on regional governance. African values have become governance values through documents like the African Charter of Democracy and Elections and the African Charter on the Values and Principles of Public Service and Administration. Participants were clear that any international framework must arise out of the African context and be informed by the African context and not be imposed from outside. Consequently, we saw in the meeting several calls from us to have a common African position on governance and development. Africa's regional governance should become a source of pride, and whilst we have NEPAD, the collective position to advance African development still needs further support. We cannot speak about governance and development without speaking about Africa's natural resources. And many discussions about reaping human development benefits from our natural wealth and how this depends on the correct policies, accountability frameworks, and governance systems to manage and utilize these resources. Without appropriate institutional arrangements to govern the utilization of these resources will become a curse and not be the blessing as intended, or ensure the full utilization of these natural resources by the peoples of the continent. We see the power of private entities with transboundary reach through this, through the whole issues of natural resources and its access. How Africa's resource wealth impacts on people's lives and the fabric of community life can be positive or profoundly negative, and that depends on governance. A common theme of our deliberation was also the acknowledgement of governance at different levels and how it's implemented. We heard cogent arguments about the increasing number of decentralization processes, growing urbanization, and the need to ensure the capacity of local authorities. At the other end of the governance spectrum was the discussion of global governance and their role to deal with critical transnational challenges, and also the need to ensure democratization of international processes. Governments have already made international commitments, but they are not implemented, and these commitments do not have a bearing on people's lives. This morning, we analyzed the question of accountability, how we monitor or assess governance, how we make sure that governments are held to account. We heard of mechanisms such as the Africa Barometer and other tools. Then the European Parliament quite candidly also told us that European governments are reducing resources, and sounded a warning of the challenges and how this will negatively impact on global solidarity as well, and how the European Parliament was trying to hold governments to that in order to ensure that there's not a breach of solidarity in a very critical way. But they went further to state that there are the reducing of resources, as I stated earlier, and that governments are not keeping to their commitment to provide development assistance to achieve the MDGs. In some discussions, participants wanted to see a separate new development goal on governance. Some participants suggested the need for coherence between international commitments and regional commitments, between development commitments and human rights commitments, looking at rule of law, the culture of constitutionalism, and so on. The views from the global consultation will be submitted to the Secretary General's high-level panel on post-2015 and to the open working group as well. We rely on all of you, parliamentarians and civil society, to be the champions for governance in the new development agenda. We rely on you to bring into this process the voices of your grassroots civil society networks and your constituencies. We will rely on the African intellectuals and academia on the African continent to play their role in a robust way, to contribute and lead discussions as well. The work does not stop today when we leave this august venue. The work continues.